In this video, I want to go ahead and talk about the next media that we're going to look at, which is ink. And the main ideas of ink is that it's going to be very similar to watercolor when we're working in Rebelle. However, there's going to be some fundamental differences, particularly at the default values. So in order to see this, what I want to do is I first want to come over here to ink and I want to see the type of brushes that we have over here. So first one I'm going to look at here is going to be the fountain pen. And I'm going to go ahead and use a color of black and I'm just going to go ahead and draw this guy in. Now, what you're going to see is that we're going to end up with a fairly dry mark, and it's going to be fairly small, and it's going to be fairly dark. Now, if I were to come over here and wet this layer and make a same type of mark, you're going to see that it will diffuse, just like watercolor will, and it's going to actually diffuse fairly aggressively. So what I want to do now is talk about how it's similar to watercolor and how it's different from watercolor. And the best way of doing that is to come over here to the watercolor tool and come to the mop and context click on that or right click on it and go over here and say copy brush preset. Then come back over here to the ink, right click in the blank area and say paste brush preset. So now we have the same type of brush that we have over here in the watercolor category here in the ink. And the next thing I want to do is I want to come over here and I want to set the size to 100% for ink. Now you're going to see this is a fairly small brush because ink tends to be fairly small when we're dealing with real ink implements in the real world. If I come back over here to watercolor, in order to match a size of 100 in ink, we would need to set this to a value of something like 40. So I'm going to go ahead and set that. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to come over here and I want to increase the loading because when we're dealing with ink, we don't have a loading value. And you can see the ink is going to be fairly dark. So to match that darkness, a loading value of somewhere around 80 is going to be accurate. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to reduce the water because at a default value for water here of 50, when we're dealing with water in watercolor, it's going to be significantly wetter. So we're going to set this to a value of 30. And now that I have these guys more or less matched across the two media, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to go ahead and pause diffusion, and I'm going to go ahead and make similar marks. So you're going to see that mark, and then I'm going to come over here and make a similar set of marks, something like that right there. You're going to see that the ink is going to have a slightly different pressure response, and this is because ink tends to be something that you're going to want to snap your feel to. But at the end of the day, it's more or less the same in terms of density in water. So I'm going to go ahead and let these guys diffuse. And you're going to see they're going to diffuse at more or less the same rate. They're going to have more or less the same darkness. And they're more or less the same brush. So at the end of the day, there's not that many differences between watercolor and ink in terms of how you can align the settings like I just did here. As a matter of fact, if you come over here to the visual settings panel and you look under watercolor behavior, you'll see that absorbency, edge darkening, canvas influence, and even the drips are all going to be settings that work just as well on ink and watercolor. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is the way that these guys diffuse. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to clear this out, I'm going to go ahead and wet that layer and then pause it, and I'm going to do the same type of marks as I did before. So I'm going to go ahead and scrub this guy in, get a little darker at the bottom. I'll come over to the ink, do the same thing. I'm going to scrub this in and then get a little darker at the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and let these guys diffuse into that wet layer. So what you're going to see is that the ink is going to diffuse a bit more aggressively than the watercolor does. Now, it's not huge, it's not a massive difference, but it is something that I feel is noticeable, particularly when you're painting wet on wet with the ink. Even with the settings in alignment with one another, there's going to be a slightly more aggressive quality to the ink. And so there are times when you might want to use ink if you want a more aggressive diffusion effect than what you might get from the same type of settings over in the watercolor. However, there are, like I say, some limitations. One of the most important limitations is that we do not have the ability to make a large size ink brush. But if you're doing small type work and you want really aggressive diffusion, it might be worth trying the ink category for that. The next thing that's kind of a difference between the two is over here, when we're dealing with watercolor, we have these various brush modes that we've already talked about. Over here, when we're dealing with ink, we do not. So when you're thinking about what you get with ink, you have to think about it as if you are always using the permanent brush with watercolor. But aside from that, everything that we already know about watercolor is going to work more or less the same way with ink. So you can see here that they're very similar to one another. And really, once you get the brushes into alignment with one another in terms of their settings, there's really not that dramatic of a difference, other than the ink itself is going to tend to have a slightly different pressure response, which you can compensate for. And it's going to diffuse a little bit more aggressively than watercolor. But otherwise, pretty much everything else is the same as what you might get from watercolor. So again, when you're thinking about the differences between ink and watercolor, they're not that different. The primary difference is that ink is meant to be for smaller brushes. It's going to tend to be for brushes that are going to be heavier on the loading, and it's going to tend to be for brushes that are going to be drier than what you might use with watercolor. But other than that, pretty much all the same things are going to be in effect.